Good afternoon, everybody. This is Talarita Tooney Rogers joining you this afternoon for the final session of the day. This session is the impact of historical trauma on American Indian culture, behavior, and health, presented by Dr. DrBegay, who was our keynote presenter this morning. As you recall, Dr. Begay is the clinical assistant professor in the Department of Psychiatry, College of Medicine at the University of Arizona. He is a cultural psychologist with a primary focus on the interrelationship of culture, biology, and environment in understanding human behavior as applicable to health and wellness. Dr. Begay possesses a Master of Public Health degree with a specialty in international health. His research interests include Native American health, especially in relation to the impact of historical trauma and the subsequent evolution of intergenerational maladaptive coping behaviors that contribute to the disproportionately high rates of stress-related chronic diseases, cancer, interpersonal violence, substance abuse, and addiction, all major contributing factors to the contemporary health and wellness of American Indians and Alaska Natives. Within this population, Dr. Begay is particularly interested in the prevalence of adverse childhood stress and intergenerational trauma to better understand the underlying mechanisms that contribute to the continuation of psychosocial risk factors that are associated with metabolic diseases, sleep disparities, depression, and other psychiatric disorders that have a tendency to get passed down to the next generation. Dr. Begay is a member of the Sleep Health and Research Program and serves as faculty affiliate with the Social Cognitive and Affective Neuroscience Laboratory. Both are entities of the University of Arizona Department of Psychiatry. Dr. Begay's presentation this afternoon will address Indigenous peoples' singular history in the United States and a distinct relationship with the federal government and its policies. This will cover the forced removal of children to boarding schools and the suppression of language and cultural traditions to the forced relocation of families and the outlawing of spiritual practices. Indigenous communities have endured historically traumatic events that continue to impact contemporary physical health, mental well-being, culture expression, and educational attainment. The trauma of the past continues to have lasting repercussions into the present on the self-identity, self-worth, and the educational achievement of Indigenous youth. This workshop will focus on the neurophysiological impact of intergenerational coping behaviors associated with the cultural augmentation resulting from historical intergenerational trauma and its impact on child development, health, and behavior. And I give you Dr. DrBegay.
Wow, thank you very much for that introduction. Let's see if I can pull up my slides. Okay, I think we're good to go. Thank you for that introduction, and welcome back, conference attendees. As I mentioned this morning, I am or is also included in the wonderful introduction. I am a clinical assistant professor in the Department of Psychiatry. I am a faculty member in the Sleep and Health Research Program and also a faculty affiliate with the Social Cognitive and Affective Neuroscience Laboratory. I'm Neuroscience Laboratory, I'm sorry. I'm very fortunate and very grateful to be part of these entities here at the University of Arizona. I think that, as I mentioned this morning, sleep is a new and up and coming area as far as sleep as far as wellness and health is concerned. And I think it's one of those things I personally, and I know a lot of my colleagues and folks that I interact with, it's one of those areas we take for granted as far as just something you do at the end of whatever it is we're engaged with. And but sleep is much more than that. Sleep is especially important in learning. There's a part of the brain called the hippocampus, and the hippocampus during rapid eye movement sleep converts short-term memory into long-term memory, and without sleep, the opportunities for academic achievement also dwindle. So I'm very, very grateful to be part of that entity, as well as to contribute to a field that's up and coming, an area that's up and coming, as far as contributing to what happens as a result of the stress response system, which I will cover this afternoon. So I appreciate, as I tried to emphasize this morning, I appreciate your attendance, your participation at this conference. I think that again, the areas of maladaptive behaviors have roots or have associations to intergenerational behaviors, specifically intergenerational trauma, that I believe, as well as other researchers, other people that study this area, have roots, deep down roots to historical trauma. And the goal for this afternoon would be to connect with what those historical traumatic events consist of, and why are we talking about this in 2020, especially during this COVID or coronavirus pandemic. I wish, again, as I know has been emphasized by other presenters, I wish this is we could congregate in one place. I would certainly enjoy conversations about the specific work that you are engaged with, and more specifically, how some of these ideas that are presented in these at this conference, but more specifically, some of the ideas that I present in regard to trauma, in regard to historical trauma, might be further enhanced and even carried out as far as interventions and prevention programs are concerned. But it is what it is, and we're here, and I am very grateful and honored to present on this topic. But as I mentioned previously, I'm a cultural psychologist, and really what that entails is that every activity has a consequence, is neurophysiological. When I say neurophysiological, I'm talking about functions of the brain as a neurophysiological consequence. That's really how we learn, and really, there are various parts of the brain that become a part of the habit-forming process. So even as we begin to engage in activities in a mindful way, there is a part of the brain called the basal ganglia, or what's known as the basal ganglia. Several structures come together, but it's really sort of our autopilot, and it subtly is the basis or the foundation for habits. So some of these habits, first of all, we don't recognize, we don't realize, and secondly, how do we change those habits? So then we get into an area of behavior modification. So I'm a graduate of Winter Rock High School. So that's another point that I want to make, is that what moves me, what motivates me, is really sort of where I come from, and that's the Navajo Nation, and growing up and experiencing life on the Navajo Nation, and experiencing firsthand alcoholism, and also the use of violence to negotiate, navigate, and sometimes even communicate, as part of life there in that specific place. I'm a psychosocial health educator, and what that really entails is that I provide information through either presentations, workshops, and other media or other forms of communication, primarily in the areas of substance abuse. I work with substance abuse treatment centers in the Tucson area. also the correctional facilities, and also working with school districts on the Navajo Nation, as well as the Tohono Nation, and groups here in Tucson, specific schools here in Tucson. But my overall, focus is really looking at what's known as toxic stress, and toxic stress is the fear and the pain that children experience. And again, from a subtle perspective, I think that a lot of behaviors in relation to family, in relation to parenting, are passed on intergenerationally. And I think there are roots for a lot of us to the boarding school system, and the boarding school system where children were removed from families and placed in these institutions. And again, I don't by any means advocate that it was all a bad, experience. There are, some good things that came out of this experience. There were, opportunities for children to move forward in urban environments, or to move forward with academic opportunities. So, I don't want to paint this picture of historical trauma, or even associated with boarding schools, as a totally negative experience. But at the same time, I think there are some biological impacts, and what I mean is that every biological organism, but specifically human beings, and especially children that have these experiences, have the potential for changes to occur to the brain. And because changes to the brain occur, the brain is the epicenter of all the other body systems. We have the hypothalamus, which actually acts as a thermostat when when different levels increase. We have, because of the hypothalamus, or in association to the hypothalamus, we have a mechanism to sort of create a balance, and that balance we refer to as homeostasis. So these changes to the brain affect the hypothalamus and also the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland is really the connection to hormone, the release of hormones in relation to all the other environmental factors. So we have environmental changes, whether that's climate, whether that's weather, whether that's heat or coldness. Or what I'm going to focus on is really sort of the stress response system. We prepare the body to fight, or to, as it's called, fight or flight, but to prepare the body to fight, or to run, to move away from that whatever's causing that stressor. And so in order to do that, blood glucose, or blood sugar, needs to be released, and also the other body systems. Adrenaline needs to be released from our autonomic nervous system, the sympathetic nervous system, to again allow the body to move away from whatever it is that's causing the fear or the pain. And over time, this becomes as I've mentioned at least 3 times now, the brain changes. It's almost like if we have an elastic band and we keep stretching that band, pretty soon the elastic wears out. And as a result of the elastic wearing out, it stays in that particular size or shape, and we refer to that as dysregulation. So the abundance of the glucocorticoid hormone and other hormones associated with stress become or freely dispersed during these stressful situations. And that creates havoc to other body systems. Our body begins to respond to that, and it really becomes the basis of disease and the basis of the core cause of some of the psychiatric changes. And what I mean by psychiatric changes, I mean perhaps an individual, because of an overstimulated sympathetic nervous system, that fight or flight mechanism, might engage in substances. So again, we have we have the pleasure center of the brain, the nucleus accumbens, that works with the ventral tegmental area to provide pleasure. And to get away from the pain and the fear, we might engage in activities that provide or stimulate that pleasure center. And again, this could be substances, chemicals, obviously drugs, alcohol, but also it could be activities such as the act of sex or sexual activity, as well as perhaps even food, consuming food as a, we've all heard that term of comfort foods, but to engage in eating foods, although our body doesn't need the energy, the nutrients, but it's the pleasure that food provides us, especially foods that are high in saturated fats. And obviously, it goes without saying, the engagement in sexual activity for the sake of intercourse, which sets up a whole host of different health outcomes that could eventually lead to health disparities of unwanted pregnancies, HIV, STDs, and other disease outcomes that we might not really think about being associated with adverse childhood stress or adverse childhood experiences that really sort of contributed to changes to the brain, that as we are adults, we engage in these activities that have outcomes that can either land us in the hospital or perhaps land us in jail in the case of overconsumption or uncontrolled consumption of alcohol or perhaps other drugs that are we cannot easily just walk away from these. And then by definition, addiction is a dependency, a physiological dependency. The brain is dependent upon that substance in order to function at a new norm, function normally. In other words, my greatest, addiction, today, right now, is really sort of caffeine and coffee. I drink probably 8 cups of coffee a day. When I don't have that much coffee or that many cups of coffee, I feel it. I don't feel engaged. I don't feel connected. But then my need for coffee is also a side effect of something else. And perhaps it's lack of sleep, not sleeping enough. Well, not sleeping enough is associated with perhaps maybe working or doing something else when I should be sleeping. And sometimes we just get in the habit of staying up, either reading, studying, or maybe even playing video games or doing something when we should be sleeping and resting our bodies. So what I'm getting at is there's a whole host of outcomes that are associated with brain function, but also can lend to disease processes. So as I mentioned earlier or this morning, there's a relationship between the environment and our biology, our physiological processes. When I say physiology, I'm talking about specific mechanisms inside the body. Biology is just a term that I use that when I talk about cells or cellular mechanisms. But when I say physiology, I'm talking specifically about what happens in the human body. And again, environmental and cultural interactions actually set off chromosomes, set off our genetic mechanism to release certain genes, or at least to code for certain genes so that we can have a specific protein that's necessary, whether that protein is a neurotransmitter in the brain or perhaps any other protein such as hair growth or even digestive enzymes are all influenced by the environment. And culture is just a human construct. When we get used to doing things, as I mentioned before, if my need to consume caffeine also has an impact, a physiological impact on my body, and that's what I described earlier is really that impact is addiction. And also, again, the power of mind as far as influencing the body. What we think about as we don't actually have to be in a place to imagine stress and fear. We can just think about it. We can contemplate on that, and we can create this uneasiness And sometimes if we don't handle stress and fear correctly, we might avoid certain stressful situations. And those stressful situations might include studying or some other self-promotional activity that, because of unresolved stress, unresolved trauma, we might not engage in those activities because of the fear that we feel today. So these are, again, just areas that I want to just touch upon. And I really, within this slide, I showed this morning, but the two sides of the coin, the neurophysiological impact, again, the changes to the brain because of adverse childhood experiences are really, there are two areas I want to focus on. One is in light blue, the HPA axis, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, which is really our stress response system. Every time we have a stressful event, this mechanism kicks in to allow, again, that fight or flight mechanism. But if we're chronically in a stressful place, this mechanism, as I mentioned earlier, with the elastic that just kind of is no longer bouncing back. It just stays put. That's really sort of what happens with the HPA axis. It becomes dysregulated, where too much cortisol is released in really small stressful events. We have a tendency to no longer decipher the amount of stress. If somebody cuts us off in traffic, we have this overblown just this mechanism that can lead to anger or lead to anxiety. And so again, these are just connections to, we're beginning to understand that this is related to biological mechanisms that are now maladaptive or dysregulative. And the other area I want to focus on is really the sympathetic nervous system. There's the brainstem is the brainstem of the brain, which runs down your spinal cord, is really sort of the basis of our what's known as the reptilian brain, where our basic survival mechanisms are tied to that. We don't need to understand that that big hairy fuzzy thing is a teddy bear. All we need to know is it might be a grizzly bear, and we need to act on that before we need to get at least 3 or 4 steps ahead of that big fuzzy hairy thing. And so over time, because of that, again, mind is contributes to that. Mind being, we can think about, we can interpret different signals, visual signals as meaning some dangerous event or dangerous item. So the sympathetic nervous system is really sort of that we have very little control once it gets activated. It's part of our, what I mean by very little control is we have very little conscious ability to interact with our autonomic nervous system. It's it's sort of the breathing mechanism. We don't have to think, breathe out, breathe in. It happens on a more automatic, regular basis. The same is true with our heart. The pacemaker cells in our heart, fire to allow the atrium and the ventricles to work together. And the same is true with what's known as peristalsis, the movement of food that we have eaten through our digestive tract. We don't have to consciously think about that. There's a mechanism in place that takes care of that, and that's part of the autonomic nervous system. There are 2 parts: the sympathetic, that fight or flight, jack up, get ready to go. And then there's the parasympathetic nervous system, that place that brings us back down. So what I'm really describing is what I referred to earlier today with, this natural order. What goes up has to come down in a healing, restorative process. But oftentimes when you're in an environment that's always full of fear, anger, and pain, your nervous system begins to just fire, and you never give it a chance to rest. And this is what the disease process and the psychiatric outcomes are all about. I apologize, I won't be snapping my fingers anymore, but my point is that this becomes very it becomes the basis of what's known as hypervigilance and hyperarousal. we get irritated and agitated very easily because of that, and we want to do something about it. And sometimes we engage in self-medicating activities, utilizing, again, chemicals, substances, food, or sexual activity. And it might not even be with sexual activity. It might not even be orgasm. It's the excitement of getting ready to go to the bar, getting ready to to pick somebody up, and so all of that, the release, the excitement of that can also be addicting, and it's a distraction from the fear and the pain that we feel. And obviously, my other my interest, as I alluded to this earlier today, is really sort of looking at resilience, looking at healing. Again, looking at these same mechanisms, but also but from a positive perspective. And again, really tapping into mind, what we think, what we believe, and the power of belief, and how that also activates certain pain receptors, or activates the release of enkephalins and endorphins, which are the body's natural opioid system, so that we don't feel the pain, we don't feel the term that comes to mind is analgesic, like an aspirin. It sort of deadens the pain. So that's again, these are all associated with stress, chronic stress, that could be, and most likely is associated with some adverse childhood experiences. But where did that adverse childhood experience come from? It comes from our, from our childhoods, from perhaps our caregivers, or those that were around us as we were young and developing. So that's, spills into an area of intergenerational, trauma, intergenerational maladaptive behaviors, and also, the core of that could be perhaps, coming out of learning that as a child, our caregivers, our parents maybe, who coming out of the boarding school system and not learning empathy, not learning how to connect on a more positive emotional basis, not providing that comfort, because that comfort was never provided to them. And so they have learned to parent. And again, I don't mean to put blame or shame out there, because this is, there are certain people that really do their best, but they're doing their best with what they have learned in the past. And perhaps what they've learned in the past is not healthy, is not helpful for children. We should be teaching our children how to negotiate and navigate life. Every now and then, I find myself at the Indian Health Service here in the Tucson area, and I am shocked sometimes to hear parents calling their children, oh, that little effer, or that, get over here, and they hit and they slap, instead of negotiating and working with children, teaching children what is the proper way. But at the same time, these parents also have their own, sympathetic nervous system that's constantly, I said I wasn't going to do this, but they're constantly firing, and they're agitated and irritated. So when a baby cries, they also have this, they haven't learned how to self-regulate. They haven't learned to take several deep breaths to calm themselves down. Again, by saying that, I tapped into my parasympathetic nervous system. As we begin to inhale and exhale, we can calm ourselves down, slow breaths. So that's self-regulation, is really sort of to understand, how we first feel an emotion like anger, and then what we can do about it in a healthy way, as opposed to just always learning to lash out with what we say, lash out with violence, lash out with, it becomes a cultural, an intergenerational process of what people learn. But also, as we begin the future or look to the future, we also incorporate these behaviors onto our children. So that's really sort of the essence of how these behaviors are intergenerational and move forward. I'm falling way behind with my time, so I'm gonna, I showed this slide earlier, but it's really sort of the reasons I'm passionate about, studying these areas, at least from a research perspective. And But you know, and I also, you know, showed this earlier, is really sort of historical trauma, and we'll get into some of these historical traumatic events that have really created these cultural changes. When I'm talking about cultural changes, I mean, you know, we're learning from those around us how to behave, how to act. But it's really sort of the basis or the foundation for intergenerational trauma, those learned responses to fear and pain. You know, we might learn from our caregivers that how they dealt with fear, how they dealt with pain is perhaps to get a 12-pack and drink that and get numbed out, get inebriated, get intoxicated, get drunk. You know, and so that becomes with that particular substance, that becomes the basis of addiction. And perhaps there are no mechanisms to seek ways of rehabilitation. And so this is a way that eventually that individual has the potential of dying from either alcohol poisoning or perhaps cirrhosis of the liver or other issues, head-on collisions perhaps, because they cannot regulate their use of that substance because of an addiction. That's just one example. We also see that with as something as safe as food, how individuals can consume enough food where they soon have diabetes or other, you know, issues that are associated with obesity and create heart problems. And they also put themselves at in a place of needing health care or sometimes emergency health care. So these are issues that become chronic as the brain changes, as our body changes. And so we seek medical attention for the far right, but they're really symptoms of something else, of intergenerational behaviors that perhaps got rooted or got their start from historical traumatic events. So I applied for a National Institute of Health grant, and I was awarded a grant to look at a group of Mexican Americans on the U.S.-Mexico border near a town of Nogales. And really, my point in showing you this is that I would like to use this opportunity as sort of developing a model to look at and address more American Indian and Alaska Native communities and populations. In other words, this is an ongoing, what we call an R01. It's a big grant, a multi-million-dollar grant. But my portion or my contribution would be looking at adverse childhood stress and intergenerational trauma. But really what I want to do is utilize this opportunity to set up a model that I can look at, American Indian, Alaska Native populations. And I emphasize that, or I mention that, and I guess I did emphasize that, is, you know, we have opportunities, whether we are in a higher education facility or whether we're just looking at more what we refer to as evidence-based strategies to address some of these issues. I think that we can sort of look in our own backyards and see these issues. As an example, oftentimes I go up to the Navajo Nation, and I see these, our beautiful, washes and the sandstone, and there's just people are dumping trash there. So the obvious question is, why are people doing that? And it usually has something to do with having to pay to put your trash into a landfill or have somebody take it away. And the other issue that I always bring up, with my community, people that live in my area when I visit, is that, firewood. There are some families that this is their enterprise. This is their ways, their means of making a living. But what happens to, trees don't grow fast. So what are we actually doing to our landscape? And again, I don't mean to be critical. I'm not, but it is an issue that I think we need to, perhaps our young individuals in high schools or even at in our institutions can begin to look at, how fast are trees being cut down, and really sort of what is the impact or the potential impact for the future. And I just throw that out because we have issues, as in our community, and looking at, what brings us to this conference, to look at, issues that affect us and really sort of drive our, our need to get answers, Those answers are, are really sort of, what is the science say in terms of, a particular issue or problem, and how can we sort of contribute to that? And, this is my take-home message when I work with high schools, and even to the point of utilizing activities. I'm a former athlete of Window Rock High School, and a former participant in college rodeo with the University of Arizona and throughout my life. But that has really made an impact on who I am today in terms of resilience, in terms of realizing that it's up to me, it's up to the self-discipline of working, of running wind sprints or working out with weights, ultimately it's to improve performance. But that can also be that same strategy can also be utilized in the academic setting or in other settings where we deal with making decisions. And how are those decisions being made? Again, just putting out some ideas, some thoughts, but really sort of the pathophysiological impact of adverse childhood stress is really sort of I mentioned the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, as well as the sympathetic nervous system, or the SAM axis, and really sort of the relationship of cortisol, the outcome, again, a glucocorticoid hormone that really sort of it becomes the basis of inflammation, and inflammation affects those those vessels of those, especially the small vessels of the brain, which again I'm talking about stroke, or perhaps some type of heart malfunction, heart disease, a myocardial infarction, perhaps a vessel gets clogged because of inflammation contributing to the buildup of other materials of plaque, for instance. And so we see the outcome, but perhaps that is associated, it's more than perhaps, it's really sort of what population, as far, when we talk about health disparities, that are really impacted by chronic stress. And that chronic stress, again, is associated with adverse childhood experiences. But even the sympathetic nervous system, again, the jacking us up to get ready to run or get ready to fight. The outcome is really sort of that hypervigilance and hyperarousal. We're always on guard. We're always looking for issues that stimulate, or maybe issues that maybe quiet that. And that's usually, because everybody else is doing it, a maladaptive way of dealing with squelching or soothing our autonomic nervous system. But also, as I mentioned, before, if our sympathetic nervous system is dysregulated or firing out of control, it affects our sleep. We don't get enough sleep, or it increases, agitation and anger. So that's, my focus is really sort of looking at the physiological impact, when we say patho, we're referring to disease processes that are associated with stress, and again, sleep. And cardiometabolic diseases that are associated with the blood glucose levels of in order to fight or flight, we've got to have energy to burn. But over a period of time, our cells respond to that increase of blood sugar. And it usually is, associated with insulin or insulin receptors that no longer do the job that they need to do to allow cells to come in, or allow sugar from the blood to come into the cells. So you get an increase of blood sugar concentration, and an increase of blood sugar concentration is basically acts as an acid. So our cells soon respond to that by getting thicker, and because the cells are thicker, oxygen and nutrients do not get into that cell. And that's really sort of the essence of amputations that are associated with diabetes. But again, I just want to sort of shed some light of current or contemporary health issues that are associated with adverse childhood stress. But adverse childhood stress, again, is a part of, or can be a part of intergenerational maladaptive behaviors, specifically intergenerational trauma. But where did that intergenerational trauma come from? That's maybe associated. And I say maybe because it's not always, with biology, it's not black and white. There are some gray areas. There are gray areas as far as buffers are concerned. There are gray areas in terms of, genetic resiliency. Our genes might be situated in a way where, we're not impacted by certain environmental influences, as would other groups. And again, the genetic connotation really is associated with, where a particular group is associated and where they're, let's say for American Indians and or for indigenous people throughout the world, but more specifically American Indians and also Asian people, we've had less experience with alcohol as a beverage, and as a result we don't have the genetic makeup to break down alcohol as would other groups or other individuals, such as the Europeans who've had alcohol more frequently or utilized alcohol in a way that we've in certain American Indian cultures, we've had medicinal alcoholic beverages. Alcohol was made, but it wasn't utilized the way it's utilized today. So again, I just want to kind of clarify I'm always sort of skeptical when somebody tells me that this is a genetic factor, when really how is this related to genes, and how is a protein that's produced by our genes, how is that related to certain behavioral characteristics? Because I think we get used to just saying that's genetic outcome, that's just the way it is, as opposed to saying, well, wait a minute here, what can we do about it? How is our behavior, how is activity, how can we change that genetic outcome? And especially with epigenetics, which is impacted by traumatic episodes. So as I mentioned before, I don't want to get into this slide, but there is a science that really looks at, in the right-hand corner, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, and also the adrenal medullary system, the SAM axis, as I mentioned previously, and really the outcomes of adrenaline and the outcomes of cortisol, a glucocorticoid hormone. And on the bottom of this slide, we can sort of see the problems of hyperarousal, hypervigilance with adrenaline that is associated with anger and violence, and also the impact of cortisol that's associated, again, with chronic inflammation and chronic diseases of the heart and diseases of also the brain. So these are sort of the basis of why we are talking about the impact of historical trauma today in 2020. But to give a better idea of the autonomic nervous system, again, that system that's more automatic. Autonomic rhymes with automatic, and there are certain things that happen during that fight or flight mechanism. As we begin, our heart begins to beat faster to get blood and nutrients to where it needs in order for our muscles to become activated. But the flip side of that is also, when I say flip side, the inverse or the opposite of that is really sort of that parasympathetic nervous system, that place of peace, calm, and relaxation. As I mentioned before, the part of natural order is when something comes up, when our fight or flight mechanism gets jacked up, we have to have a mechanism to bring us back down to restoration and healing. And that's really what the parasympathetic nervous system is involved with. I showed this slide earlier. I'm going to skip it. I'm falling behind with time. My focus is really sort of looking at stress response hormones. Stress response hormones, and also pro-inflammatory cytokines that might we look at whole blood. We separate the plasma, the gold stuff, from that whole blood, and that's where the concentrations of glucocorticoid hormones or other hormones and proteins that are associated with the stress response system, to give us an idea of what is influencing from a physiological basis the stress response system or behaviors in relation to stress, in relation to adverse childhood stress. But I want to get into historical trauma. But these are, again, I think that it was United States federal policy to, again, kill the Indian and save the man. There has been an influx, since the arrival of Europeans to this continent, of moving from the east to the west, and the indigenous people who incorporated in their life, their worldview, this indigenous or this spiritual component that took into consideration the earth, that took into consideration the environment, that took into consideration what happens to the universe. And so these individuals stood in the way of the progress coming from the east. So something had to be done. This is really what was referred to as the Great Indian Wars. And it was, one of the U.S. cavalry, the Army generals, Pratt, that really, I can't remember Pratt's first name, that really sort of instigated or thought of the idea of utilizing schools or places to begin to focus on the youth and to change the thinking of the youth, so that the theoretical thought was that as indigenous people, the so-called primitives, as they became more sophisticated, they would also see the values of the majority culture. So that was really sort of the basis of this being a United States federal policy of placing indigenous people of this country into boarding schools. But the outcome is horrific, as we're beginning to, as I will also describe. But these are handcuffs for children in order to move them from their families or from their homes into these institutions. So I think we all have a general concept of really what historical trauma is, and I'm very grateful for the work of Maria Yellow Horse Braveheart and the work that she has sort of the foundation that she has laid for this type of work with American Indian and Alaska Native populations. But I think we're moving into an area of really sort of what has the outcome been, the pathophysiological outcome. And I mentioned those in terms of intergenerational behaviors, but also the changes to the brain that occur, but also lend to disease. There are certain things that we know, but I think that the science is moving towards understanding what is the cause for the diseases and the outcome, the psychiatric outcome, being grounded or based upon addiction, and also what happens with head-on collisions and the relationship to individuals that come from these places. And so that's when we talk about historical trauma, these are the main points of ethnic and cultural genocide, community massacres, genocidal policies of in the 70s. There was even again part of the U.S. Policy or the U.S. government in association with Health and Human Services, Department of Health and Human Services, that in the Public Health Department in the Indian Health Service, which falls under the Department of Health, there was a non-disclosed efforts to sterilize women. And so this happened just as recently as the 70s. In the forced relocation, we've for as an example, we're relocated to southern New Mexico, and same with other tribal people throughout this country. Some moved to Florida, to the southern part of Florida, where their ancestral homes were in Oklahoma or the Dakotas. So there are stories of these events, and the reason I say there are stories because we're still talking about this today, but the ramifications are associated with historical trauma. And obviously the prohibition of spiritual and cultural practice, including speaking the language. But I think when we talk about historical trauma, the real real effort or the real impact comes from the boarding school system. And again, I do not want to, I do not want to pretend, nor do I want to advocate that all boarding school experiences were negative. There are some positive boarding schools. My mentor, Dr. Jenny Joe, here at the University of Arizona, speaks very, very, very highly of her experiences in the boarding school, coming from a place and having, not having that, the impact, the negative impact of a boarding school system. And so these are some of the outcomes, as I've already mentioned, but I want to connect that to, to the literature, the increase of interpersonal violence, the increase of childhood abuse and neglect, the increase or association to poor health, again, related to pro-inflammatory mechanisms, and poor academic achievement. The hippocampus, again, that area where, short-term memory gets converted to long-term memory, is impacted by the glucocorticoid hormone cortisol also. Cortisol interferes with cellular development. In other words, cells and growth does not occur because of cortisol. And so that's the association to academic achievement. In addition to, because of border towns and what happens because of a dry, alcohol is prohibited, and as well as other drugs on Indian reservations, people that now become addicted find their way to these border towns. And oftentimes there is conflict with these border towns that eventually end up in negative stereotypes, or, here come those drunks again coming into town. And so it sets up a real negative relationship also. And this is sort of the, my model, and I'm currently working on a paper that describes, again, in general, we talk of acts of genocide, or what we call historical traumatic events, but the outcome has been a cultural disconnect of wellness and healing practices. And really sort of this is a cycle. In the lower left-hand corner is really where we're at today. This becomes an intergenerational, self-perpetuating. That means we're involved with allowing this to happen. We, being community members, self-perpetuating, self-inflicting coping behaviors that are also coupled with other mechanisms, such as poverty. We've gotten to the point now where this process is happening without really, understanding the mechanisms. And to the right is really sort of if we want to address this cultural crisis, and this is again my perspective, of dealing or understanding the impact of self-esteem and self-identity, to really begin to move towards self-empowerment, self-determination, and really what tribal sovereignty is. In other words, what are the traditional or ancestral ways of governing people? There are tribes in the United States that are having a very difficult time adapting to, the three branch of government of the United States: the executive, legislative, and what's the other one? And the other arm of the of a governing system. And so these, again, I don't want to spend too much time. This is a very busy slide, but really sort of the intergenerational part is that fear, shame, and pain are accepted. This becomes an acceptable way of dealing with the stresses in our life. And once something gets accepted, then it changes the culture. And again, this is a human phenomenon. This is not just something that American Indians, Alaska Natives, or we accept, or we are unique to our groups that we work with or that we're a part of. But this is a human phenomenon. And this is really what brings, in my opinion, what also brings us to this conference, this week, is that, that through the efforts of self-medication, through anger, through violence, anger and manipulation, through other mechanisms that really look to control, we soon see outcomes that are associated with suicide ideation, that are associated with addiction, that are associated with other violent activities that soon land us in a correctional, facility. That the next generation is lessened by caregivers that are now in jail or in prison because of something a crime they committed. Well, maybe they were in a blackout, or maybe they were in an intoxicated state. So, when we talk about the augmentations of culture, these are just, some of the examples of how, this intergenerational maladaptive behaviors have really changed, and I'll even call it a cultural augmentation of the American Indian and Alaska Native or Indigenous people that have been, subjected to these types of historical traumatic events. And I want to leave it. I want to leave my presentation now. It's let's see. Did I get a? Okay. I think I'm going to leave my presentation here. Are there any questions? I guess I should let our moderator let me know whether I should continue or with 4 minutes left, or perhaps take a few questions.
I think we could try to take a question or two.
I'm game.
If you can go, participants, if you can go ahead and raise your hand in the reaction button at the bottom of your screen, and we'll select a question for Dr. Tommy DrBegay to address.
If there are no questions, I can move through a couple more slides. I also, in the introductory slide, I left my email address. So if there are additional questions, please send me an email message, and I really try hard to get back with all responses that I get, because I think this is an important area that in relation to what brings us to this conference, but specifically, to understand, what has happened and how the past is really sort of driving what we do today as far as health and wellness, and also health disparities are concerned. There was a question in the chat box, and it has to do with sacred wisdom. I think that the ultimate, in my opinion, the ultimate benefit of sacred wisdom, and that's really sort of the association of the universe and our Mother Earth, and is really sort of to exercise and practice love, self-love, forgiveness, but also transfer that love into the work that you do. Transfer that love in your relationships with your children, with your family, and make this begin to change the process. If you're not already doing this, I don't mean to assume that this is not happening. This is happening. This is what because of these historically traumatic events, we no longer connect in this connect in a way to exercise love, and love is really sort of that we take in from what we believe of the universe, whatever spiritual philosophy, whatever religion, the outcome should be to connect with that, but to share that in a loving way, in a good way. And that's really sort of even in a courageous way, where we take this energy, we take this connection with the light and also warmth, and we share that. We make a difference on this planet by what we do. We make a difference in our daily activities by what we do.
Dr. DrBegay, thank you so much. That is all the time that we have for this session. I've included your email address as well as your contact information through the University of Arizona in the chat box. So participants, you're able to reach out to Dr. DrBegay for additional questions. I do know that Dr. DrBegay is also a highly sought speaker, so you can follow his profile in the chat box for additional presentations he'll be providing in the near future. And again, Dr. DrBegay, thank you so much. Your words and your knowledge are very much needed within this field, and we greatly appreciate your participation.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the awesome facilitation, and thank you all also for making time and effort to be a part of this this conference. It's It's an area that we oftentimes don't take, don't realize the impact on a personal level, on a professional level, but also what is our place, what is our purpose, and what can we do to make this, make our immediate environments and theoretically make the world a better place. Thank you very much. Have a wonderful day and enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you.